£144. That's what a 1,000-acre farm made in an entire year. Strange number, but it's not the strangest thing about Season 2, because the real story isn't the farming at all. It's a newspaper column that nearly killed the show stone dead before Episode 1 aired. A badger with a grudge. A man who needs his own subtitles to be understood. 20 facts, none of them about farming. Kettle on. This gets weird fast, and it doesn't slow down. Before a single frame of Season 2 reached anyone's television, the entire show very nearly didn't survive to be broadcast at all. In December 2022, just weeks before launch, Jeremy Clarkson wrote a newspaper column about Meghan Markle so incendiary it made headlines entirely of its own, for entirely the wrong reasons. It wasn't a farming story, it wasn't even remotely connected to diddly squat, but it landed at the worst possible moment, right as marketing for the new series was ramping up, and suddenly the two stories, the columnist and the farmer, became impossible for anyone to separate in the press. Amazon went quiet, the way big corporations go quiet when they're quietly panicking. Advertisers got twitchy, executives who had nothing whatsoever to do with cattle or council planning found themselves in meetings discussing whether launching at all was still a good idea. There was genuine, serious conversation in boardrooms that had never once mentioned a tractor about whether this was the end of the road for the whole enterprise. Clarkson had spent an entire calendar year up to his knees in mud, building something gentle, honest and, by his own admission, barely profitable. And with one column, written in an entirely different context for an entirely different audience, all of that work was suddenly at risk of being smothered before viewers even got the chance to judge it on its own merits. It didn't just survive that fortnight of uncertainty, it thundered back with a force nobody, least of all the nervous executives, had predicted. When Season 2 finally landed on the 10th of February 2023, it didn't limp quietly onto Prime Video, hoping nobody would notice. It broke UK viewing records for Amazon, becoming the platform's single biggest homegrown hit off the back of the very controversy that was supposed to sink it without trace. Viewers, it turned out, were entirely capable of separating the newspaper columnist from the cowman in wellies fighting with a fence. They tuned in anyway, in numbers Amazon had never previously recorded for a British original production. Critics who'd braced themselves for a boycott found themselves writing reviews instead. Sometimes a story writes its own comeback, whether the people running the marketing department believe it will or not, and nobody in that particular room back in December saw a record-breaking February coming. Here's the detail. People forget the moment they binge all 8 episodes over a rainy weekend. That entire chaotic year of farming took an entire year to actually film. No cutting corners for the schedule, no compressing 4 seasons into a convenient 6-week shoot. Clarkson said as much himself, bluntly, when a journalist asked how quickly a second series might be turned around after the first one landed so well. Not soon. It'll take a year to film it. That's how farming works. Crops simply do not hurry along for a broadcast slot, however much a streaming platform might like them to. Cows do not carve to a production deadline, no matter how tight the edit schedule gets back in London. The camera crew turned up, week after week, whatever grim weather the Cotswolds decided to throw at them that particular Tuesday, and simply waited, patiently, repeatedly, sometimes for months at a stretch, for the farm itself to hand them a story worth keeping. And underneath all the jokes, that story started from one genuinely brutal number that Clarkson repeats throughout the season, like a scar he can't quite stop touching. 1,000 acres. 12 months of relentless, physically punishing work. A grand total profit, at the end of it all, of £144. That is not a punchline dreamed up by a scriptwriter for comic effect. There was no scriptwriter, remember. That is the actual bottom line. The real figure from the real accounts that sent a multi-millionaire television presenter scrambling into cattle farming, amateur brewing, and a bruising, drawn-out fight with his local council. Because doing absolutely nothing was quite simply no longer an option he could afford to take. So he got cows, big, expensive, deceptively slow-moving cows, brought in specifically to replace the sheep that had caused him such spectacular grief throughout the whole of Season 1. And within a handful of episodes, in a storyline literally, unambiguously titled Cowering, his brand new herd did the one thing absolutely nobody on the production had planned for. They simply went straight through the fence that was meant to keep them contained. Livestock, it turns out, has never once read a business plan and has no plans to start now. Clarkson had effectively swapped one set of unpredictable, four-legged, entirely uncooperative headaches for a slightly larger, slightly more expensive version of the exact same problem, and the fencing repair bill quietly joined the sheep dip and the endless tractor maintenance on the ever-growing pile of costs nobody had warned him about when he bought this place. Right, that's 5 facts down, and we've barely scratched the surface. So if you're already enjoying the madness of it all, now's exactly the moment to hit like, drop a comment telling us which fact has surprised you most so far, and subscribe with that notification bell switched on so you don't miss what's coming, because we've still got badgers, beer, hospital corridors, and a council meeting that turned into a full-blown circus still ahead of us. And honestly, it only gets stranger from here. Ask any Cotswold farmer, quietly, over a pint, what actually keeps them awake at 3 a.m, and badgers come up faster than almost anything else. And Season 2 gave that particular fear its own dedicated, genuinely tense storyline. One episode has Jeremy coming face to face with what the show itself openly frames as his nemesis. And it isn't a rival farmer, and it isn't even the endlessly uncooperative weather, it's a badger. Bovine tuberculosis is a genuine, career-ending, herd-destroying threat to British cattle farmers, spread in significant part by badger populations, and it's one of the very few subjects in the entire series where Clarkson's usual stream of jokes simply drops away entirely and doesn't come back for several long, uncomfortable minutes. For that stretch of runtime, the comedy stops dead, the music softens, and you're watching a genuinely worried man grasp properly, for the first time, how easily years of investment and hope could be wiped out by an animal. He isn't even legally permitted to touch, trap, or move. Season 2 also contains one of the show's quietest, most sobering stretches of screen time. A genuine, unscripted health scare that pulled Jeremy away from the farm entirely and into a hospital corridor for a run of tests nobody had planned for. There's no stunt here, no manufactured drama for the cameras, just a middle-aged man sitting on a plastic chair being told, calmly, to hold still, while doctors check something that had genuinely worried them. It barely gets more than a few minutes of screen time in the finished edit, and Clarkson underplays the whole thing the way Englishmen of a certain generation are trained from birth to underplay absolutely everything. But it's there deliberately, sitting quietly beneath all the tractor jokes and the council letters, a reminder threaded through the whole season that everything on this farm, the cattle, the crops, the man himself, is running on borrowed time, a bit of luck, and rather more stubbornness than sense. Amid all that drama, there was one genuinely sweet, unguarded addition to the family that fans latched onto almost instantly and never quite let go of. 2 new puppies, named Sansa and Arya, after the Stark sisters from Game of Thrones. In a season otherwise stuffed to bursting with council enforcement letters, dead calves and hospital waiting rooms, these 2 puppies became the emotional palate cleanser, the soft, warm thing viewers clipped, shared, and rewatched long after the planning disputes had been forgotten entirely. Even Clarkson, a man not exactly renowned for public displays of sentimentality on camera, visibly softens the moment either dog wanders unscripted into shot. Caleb Cooper had already stolen scenes with alarming regularity throughout Season 1, but Season 2 is precisely where he stopped being a supporting character and started becoming a genuine phenomenon in his own right, entirely independent of the man who technically employed him. Off the back of the show's runaway success, he began writing books, touring the length and breadth of the country with his own live stage show, and watching "Get to Work" turn into a catchphrase that total strangers would shout at him, delighted, across supermarket car parks. Clarkson had originally hired a young local contractor to help keep a struggling farm ticking over. What he'd actually done, almost entirely by accident, was help launch a proper broadcasting career running in parallel to his own. And that career kept expanding at exactly the same speed as his personal life, because during the time frame the show covers, Caleb became a father, welcoming a son named Oscar into a household that already had precious little spare time to give. It's the kind of small, human detail that never makes the trailer, never gets a dramatic music sting, and and simply sits quietly underneath everything else. A reminder that behind the tractor banter, the shouted arguments about straight lines and the running jokes at Jeremy's expense, these are real people whose whole lives were shifting and changing at exactly the same relentless pace as the farm around them. Now, the restaurant, arguably the single biggest storyline of the entire season. If Season 1's drama was sheep, Season 2's drama is bureaucracy in its purest, most maddening form. And nothing captures that better than the barn Clarkson tried to quietly convert into a farm-to-table restaurant. He genuinely believed he'd found a workable loophole through permitted development rights, had the lambing shed converted at real speed with a small army of local builders, and had the doors open to paying customers before the council could formally object to any of it. And for a while, remarkably, it worked. Locals queued down the lane, the food went out, plate after plate. And then, inevitably, the enforcement notice landed, and the entire venture had to close its doors again. The whole rise and fall saga compressed into what felt, on screen, like the length of a single English summer that had barely got started. The council showdown that followed didn't happen quietly behind closed doors in some dusty committee room, the way these things usually do. It happened in a packed public hall, cameras rolling, journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder, alongside genuinely worried locals, turning what should have been a routine, forgettable planning hearing into something considerably closer to theatre. Objectors stood up, one after another, to have their say. Supporters stood up right back at them. Clarkson sat through the entire thing looking, by his own account, like a man who had somehow wandered into completely the wrong kind of courtroom by mistake. It remains one of the most quietly tense, genuinely gripping sequences in the whole series, precisely because absolutely none of it was staged for effect. Here's the twist almost nobody watching at home clocked at the time. The council's single most restrictive condition, that everything sold in the farm shop had to be sourced from within 16 miles of the farm gate, no exceptions, was designed quite deliberately to limit Diddley Squat's ambitions and keep the whole operation small. Instead, it built something considerably better than anyone had intended. Lisa Hogan later admitted, openly and without much prompting, that the rule forced her to go hunting for local honey producers, cheesemakers, and small growers she would genuinely never have discovered otherwise, turning what was meant as a punishment into a proper, thriving local cooperative. The council thought they were putting up a fence to contain him. What they actually built, without meaning to, was a supply chain. Season 2 is also where Hawkston Lager properly enters the story for the first time. A beer brewed using barley grown right there in the same fields viewers had already watched being ploughed, drilled and rained on throughout the series. What started out as one throwaway diversification idea among a dozen others quietly became the single most commercially significant thing to emerge from the entire show, eventually landing in thousands of pubs and supermarket shelves right across the country. Nobody watching that very first chaotic brewing scene, all improvised measurements and mild panic, would have guessed for a second they were quietly witnessing the birth of one of the fastest growing drinks brands in modern Britain. And true to form, Clarkson simply could not resist branding the whole operation with his usual schoolboy sense of humour. Milk from the new herd got sold, deadpan, as cow juice. Honey from the farm's own hives became bee juice. It's exactly the sort of naming decision that really shouldn't work on a premium farm shop shelf, sitting next to jars costing considerably more than the supermarket equivalent. And yet it works perfectly, because it's precisely the joke you'd expect from a man who spent decades naming supercars after things that go bang. Every farm, it turns out, needs one character whose entire job is delivering bad news with a completely straight face. And on Diddley Squat that role belongs unmistakably to land agent Charlie Ireland, nicknamed Cheerful Charlie, for the driest, most ironic possible reason. He is very rarely cheerful, and he is almost always the man standing in the yard explaining patiently why yet another plan has just been refused by somebody in an office 30 miles away. His deadpan delivery of council rejections, subsidy paperwork, and regulatory small print became one of Season 2's quiet comic engines throughout. The perpetually calm, straight man absorbing every single blow so that Clarkson could react to it, loudly, for the cameras. The farm shop itself, meanwhile, largely away from the shouting and the council letters, was quietly turning into by far the most successful part of the entire operation. Within the time frame the show covers, its recorded assets climbed from around £44,000 to well over £1.3 million. A shift so dramatic on paper, it barely resembles the same modest little business that started it all. Visitor numbers rose so sharply, so quickly, that local police genuinely had to step in and manage the resulting traffic, with queues of cars stretching for miles along narrow country lanes that were never remotely built to handle that kind of footfall on a wet Tuesday afternoon. The Lamborghini tractor, introduced with considerable fanfare back in Season 1, remained a running joke throughout the whole of Season 2, a machine that is wildly, almost comically, oversized for the vast majority of jobs it's actually asked to do around a modest working farm. Clarkson never quite lived it down, and the show never once let him forget it, wheeling the tractor back into shot at exactly the moments its sheer impracticality would sting the hardest. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being simply a piece of expensive farm machinery and became something closer to a recurring character in its own right, one that everybody involved seemed to enjoy mocking equally. Given the sheer scale of the newspaper storm that nearly capsized the whole launch before it began, most people working inside television circles quietly expected the Season 2 to be the last anyone ever saw of Diddley Squat. Instead, precisely the opposite happened. Audience figures, glowing critical reviews, and sheer relentless word of mouth pushed Amazon not merely to commission a third series, but to commit to a future for the show stretching well beyond anyone's initial, cautious expectations. A show that industry insiders had quietly assumed would be retired ended up becoming one of the platform's genuine flagship successes, built almost entirely on the strength of one difficult, brilliant, thoroughly chaotic farming year. And perhaps the strangest fact of the entire 20 is the one that's easiest to overlook entirely. None of it, at any point, was scripted. Every disaster, every council rejection, every ambitious new sideline that quietly blew up in someone's face came from real events unfolding in genuine real time, with a production crew simply standing nearby, with cameras ready to catch it. Clarkson has said as much himself, plainly and repeatedly, in interviews. No script, no planned outcomes, nothing manufactured purely for the sake of drama. Season 2 isn't a familiar television format, wearing the costume of farming for 8 episodes. It's an actual, unforgiving, thoroughly bruising farming year that simply happened to have cameras standing in the mud alongside it, week after week, for 12 straight months. Head of security, Gerald Cooper speaks in such a thick, rapid Cotswold dialect that even the show's own professional subtitle team have had genuine, publicly documented trouble keeping up with him, to the point where his lines have reportedly needed extra passes and careful re-listening just to be properly understood by viewers outside the immediate region. It isn't laziness on the production's part, it's a genuine dialect barrier, the sort that's been quietly dying out across rural England for decades, preserved almost by accident in one stonewalling septuagenarian who happens to be brilliant on camera. Clarkson has joked more than once, entirely straight-faced, that Gerald is the only man on the entire farm who genuinely needs translating for an English-speaking audience, watching in their own living room, in their own country, in a show filmed less than 80 miles from London. And somehow that's never once been the joke at Gerald's expense. If anything, it's made him more beloved, not less. The living proof that Diddley Squat is a real working farm rather than a stage set. In a show already stuffed full of things nobody watching at home ever expected. Badgers, beer, hospital corridors, council circuses. The fact that one of its most quietly beloved characters occasionally requires his own dedicated subtitles feels like exactly the right, slightly absurd cherry to finish the whole thing off. So there it is. A farm that started the year with £144 to its entire name survived a newspaper scandal that very nearly ended the whole show before it began and came out the other side with its own beer, its own restaurant saga, a badger for a nemesis, 2 puppies named after Stark sisters, and viewing figures Amazon had genuinely never seen before from a British original. Season 2 didn't simply follow up Season 1 and hope for the best. It took every single risk that could plausibly have sunk it, and somehow turned each and every one of them into precisely the reason people kept coming back, week after week. That's not luck, that's a farm and a farmer, that simply refuse point blank to be boring. And that's your lot for today. If you've enjoyed picking through the mud with us, and honestly, if you've made it all the way to a Cotswold badger and a man who needs his own subtitles, we rather think you have. Do us a genuine favour and hit that like button before you go anywhere else. Drop a comment below telling us which of these 20 facts you didn't already know. Or better still, which one you're going to bring up at the next family gathering, as though you'd known it for years. And if you're not already subscribed with that notification bell switched on, now really is the moment, because we've got plenty more of this coming. We're back very soon with more from the world of British old money, British eccentrics, and the odd bloke in a battered barber jacket who somehow keeps turning one disaster after another into an empire worth millions. Until then, mind the fences, keep half an eye out for badgers, put the kettle on for the next one, and we'll see you very soon.